Now, the November elections of 1940 saw Roosevelt win an unprecedented third term. The majority of the country was coming around to the idea giving Britain all-out aid would help us. By December, the British government ran out of money to pay for its war materials. They wanted America to give them whatever they needed without paying for it. Roosevelt realized the importance of keeping Britain in the war fighting Hitler. If Great Britain went down and the Nazis occupied the British Isles, America would be fighting Hitler alone and fighting from America's shores. Now, Roosevelt came up with a simple but brilliant idea to help the British. And it all revolved around a garden hose. Well, not really, but he used the analogy of loaning your neighbor your garden hose to put out a house fire. Now, Roosevelt had to remove the dollar sign. When sending arms, munition, and hardware to Britain, he declared that the U.S. would be the arsenal of democracy. The U.S. would supply the war needs of Britain. After June of 1941, the USSR would also be a beneficiary of Lend-Lease, without requiring monetary payment. Roosevelt held a press conference on December 17, 1940. He explained to the reporters that he was eliminating the dollar sign, and he did this in simplistic terms so every American could understand the situation. Quote, "Well, let me give you an illustration. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him put out his fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him before the operation, 'Neighbor, that garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it.' What is the transaction that goes on? I don't want $15. I just want my garden hose back after the fire is over. All right? If it all goes through the fire all right, intact, without any damage to it, he gives me back my hose. Thanks me very much for the use of it. But suppose it gets smashed up. It's got holes in it during the fire. We don't have to have too much formality about it, but I say to him, 'I was glad to lend you that hose. I can see I can't use it anymore. It's all smashed up.' He says, 'How many feet of it were there?' I tell him, 'There was about 150 feet of it.' He says, 'All right, I'll replace it.' Now, if I get a nice garden hose back, I'm in pretty good shape. In other words, if you lend certain munitions and get the munitions back at the end of the war, if they are intact and haven't been hurt, you are all right. If they have been damaged or have deteriorated or been lost completely, it seems to me you come out pretty well if you have them replace it by the fellow to whom you have lent them to." Lend-Lease was passed on March 11, 1941. In his congressional testimony, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee during the debate over Lend-Lease, "We are buying, we're not lending. We are buying our own security while we prepare. By our delay during the past 6 years while Germany was preparing, we find ourselves unprepared and unarmed, facing a thoroughly prepared and armed potential enemy."
I ask this Congress for authority and for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds to be turned over.
Now, with the Nazi conquest of Western Europe in June of 1940, the Netherlands were under the control of Hitler. This also meant that their colonies were potentially under Nazi control. 2 of these colonies directly affected the United States, Greenland and Iceland. By 1941, it had become obvious that Hitler had designs on Greenland and Iceland. Germany, using Focke-Wulf F-200 Condor planes, were making reconnaissance flights over Greenland. Now, ever since the Netherlands had been occupied by the Nazi government and Greenland had been ignoring any orders or directives issued by them. The website www.2days.com states, on April 9, 1941, the Danish minister in Washington, D.C., Henrik Kaufmann, signed a treaty with the United States authorizing the U.S. to protect the remote Danish colonies of Greenland against attack by non-American powers, and to construct military stations on the island for that purpose. The Danish envoys, notable for refusing to recognize the Nazi occupation of his country, was supporting this move by Danish diplomats in the United States and by authorities in Greenland, even though he had no real authority to do it. The next day, April 10th, Roosevelt claimed that Greenland and Iceland were part of the Western Hemisphere. This meant that the Monroe Doctrine could be invoked when dealing with German warships lurking around either Greenland or Iceland, or in the unlikely event Germany did invade these two countries or colonies. The other reason the U.S. occupied Greenland and Iceland were the cryolite mines in Greenland. Cryolite was a strategic resource for the Allies. Cryolite is a mineral used in making aluminum. Now, in modern warfare, aluminum is just as important as gunpowder. Roosevelt did not want Hitler to have control over those mines. With the friendly occupation of Greenland and the takeover of the British bases in Iceland, the U.S. was now justified in extending its neutrality zone west of the 25th longitude. This is 3/4 of the way across the Atlantic. Roosevelt sent a communique to Churchill through his U.S. ambassador in England, John Gilbert Winnet, on April 11, 1941. He stated, "We propose immediately to take the following steps in relation to the security of the Western Hemisphere, which steps will favorably affect your shipping problem. But it is important for domestic political reasons, which you will readily understand, that this action be taken by the U.S. unilaterally and not after diplomatic conversations between you and us. Therefore, before taking this unilateral action, I want to tell you about the proposal. This government proposes to extend the present so-called security zone and patrol area, which have been in effect since very early in the war, to a line covering all North Atlantic waters west of about longitude 25 degrees. We will want, in great secrecy, notification of movements of your convoys so our patrol units can seek out any ships or planes of aggressor nations operating west of the new line of security zone. We will immediately make public to you position aggressor ships or planes when located in our patrol area west of the west longitude 25 degree. Was Roosevelt orchestrating an incident that would bring the U.S. into a war with Germany? I don't believe he was hoping for a cause belli. However, if you look at the strategic situation at the time, Roosevelt needed popular support from the American people for any declaration of war. The American public was all for supporting Britain in their fight against Hitler, as long as the country did not have to send troops. I believe Roosevelt was sending a signal to Hitler to back off in the Western Hemisphere. Stay out of my backyard. And any ships being escorted by U.S. Navy vessels were off limits. Now, on July 2nd, 1941, Admiral King issued orders for the Atlantic Patrol to begin convoy duty. The Navy was to prevent interference with U.S. flag shipping by belligerents by force of arms if necessary, maintain constant and immediate readiness to repel hostile attacks, to the end that untoward incidents may be prevented when east of longitude 65, west north of 20 degrees north latitude, also east of 60 degrees west longitude and south 20 degrees north latitude. Show navigational lights and normal deck and other outboard lights in the event of contact with Axis ships. Trail and report as required. Protect American shipping by deterring influence of your presence and physical interposition between American ships and Axis ships. Do not attack unless the Axis ships actually attacks first or attempts physical interference with American shipping. And finally, if an Axis ship attacks, use every weapon at your disposal to destroy the Axis ship. The Atlantic Patrol was now going to convoy Allied shippings. Americans did not realize it at the time, but for all intents and purposes, President Roosevelt, CNO Admiral Stark, Admiral King, CNC Atlantic Fleet, had declared war with the Kriegsmarine. The majority of the American public were willing to support Great Britain and the USSR in their fight against Hitler, but they were not willing to declare war on Germany. The U.S. Navy was convoying all U.S. flagged ships as well as any Allied ships who joined the convoy to Iceland and Greenland, as well as reporting belligerent ships in the safety zone. It was just a matter of time before an incident occurred. Was Roosevelt hoping for an incident where American lives were lost? I don't think so. Nothing in the official record indicates he was setting up an incident to enrage the American people to declare war on Germany. I believe it was a little more subtle. If we look at the Greer incident, you'll see what I mean. The first incident occurred on September 4th, 1941. The USS Greer, a Wilkes-class World War I four-piper, was carrying mail and passengers to Iceland as part of her regular duties in the Atlantic Patrol. At 8:40 that morning, Greer, carrying mail and passengers to Iceland, was informed by a British plane of the presence of a submerged submarine about 10 miles directly ahead. Acting on the information from the British plane, the Greer proceeded to search for the submarine, and at 09:20 she located the submarine directly ahead of her by underwater sound equipment. The Greer proceeded then to trail the submarine and broadcast the submarine's position. This action taken by the Greer was in accordance with her orders, that is, to give out information but not attack. The British plane continued in the vicinity of the submarine until 10:32, but prior to her departure, the plane dropped 4 depth charges in the vicinity of the submarine. The Greer maintained contact until about 12:48. During this period, that's 3 hours 28 minutes, the Greer maneuvered so as to keep the submarine ahead. Now at 12:40, submarine changed course, closed the Greer, and at 12:45, an impulse bubble indicating the discharge of a torpedo by the submarine was sighted close aboard the Greer. At 12:49, torpedo track was sighted, crossing the wake of the ship from starboard to port, a distance of about 100 yards astern. At this time, the Greer lost sound contact with the submarine. At 1300, the Greer started searching for the submarine, and at 1512, the Greer made underwater contact with the submarine. The Greer immediately attacked with depth charges. Admiral Stark, CNO, testified before Congress as to the details of the Greer incident. Senator Nye, who was an avowed isolationist, summarized Stark's testimony. The British patrol plane, which was working with the Greer, was low in fuel and was returning to base. The plane dropped depth charges on the submarine. The German sub-commander had no way of knowing that a British plane just attacked them. He had to assume it was the Greer. In response, the sub fired a torpedo at the Greer. The Greer returned fire. Plausible deniability. Nye then stated, "Mr. President, the Greer incident, as it stands recorded now, finds us having issued an engraved invitation for the incident." Nye then said, "What the sub-commander did was probably less than we would have done in the same situation." What Roosevelt wanted was a justifiable reason to issue a shoot-on-sight order.
My fellow Americans, the Navy Department of the United States has reported to me that on the morning of September 4th, the United States destroyer Greer, proceeding in full daylight toward Iceland, had reached a point southeast of Greenland. She was carrying American mail to Iceland. She was flying the American flag. Her identity as an American ship was unmistakable. She was then and there attacked by a submarine. Germany admits that it was a German submarine. The submarine deliberately fired a torpedo at the Greer, followed later by another torpedo attack. In spite of what Hitler's propaganda bureau has invented, and in spite of what any American obstructionist organization may prefer to believe, I tell you the blunt fact that the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer without warning and with deliberate design to sink her. Our destroyer at the time was in waters which the government of the United States had declared to be waters of self-defense, surrounding outposts of American protection. My obligation as president is historic. It is clear Yes, it is inescapable. It is no act of war on our part when we decide to protect the seas that are vital to American defense. The aggression is not ours. Ours is solely defense. But let this warning be clear. From now on, if German or Italian vessels of war enter the waters, the protection of which is necessary for American defense, they do so at their own peril.
The Greer incident gave Roosevelt his reason. October 16, 1941, the USS Kearney was escorting a convoy in the North Atlantic before the United States entered the war. 3 merchant ships in the convoy were torpedoed. Kearney immediately began dropping depth charges and continued its barrage throughout the night. At the beginning of the mid-watch, that's just after midnight on October 17th, the torpedo struck the Kearney on the starboard side. The crew was able to confine flooding to the forward fire room, enabling the ship to get out of the danger zone with power from the aft fire room. Regaining power in the forward fire room, Kearney did steam to Iceland at 10 knots. Kearney made port on October 19th. They lost 11 sailors, 22 others were injured in the attack. After temporary repairs, Kearney got underway Christmas Day, and 6 days later they landed in Boston, Massachusetts for permanent repairs. So the incidents are getting closer and closer. The final incident will come with the USS Reuben James. Reuben James and the Kearney and the Greer were all carrying out the orders issued by CNC Atlantic Admiral King and the CNO Admiral Stark. Now the USS Reuben James was an old 4-stack destroyer from World War I. October 23rd, the Reuben James sailed from Naval Station Argenta, Newfoundland, with 4 other destroyers escorting eastbound convoy HX-156. At dawn on October 31st, the ship was torpedoed near Iceland by German submarine U-552, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Eric Taub. Reuben James had positioned itself between an ammunition ship in the convoy and the known position of the German Wolfpack, a group of submarines poised to attack the convoy. The destroyer was not flying the ensign of the United States and was in the process of dropping depth charges on another U-boat when it was engaged. The Reuben James was hit forward by a torpedo meant for the merchant ship, and her entire bow was blown off when a magazine exploded. The bow sank immediately. The aft section floated for 5 minutes before going down. Of a crew of 7 officers and 136 enlisted men, plus 1 enlisted passenger, 100 were killed, leaving only 44 enlisted men and no officers who survived the attack. Even the sinking of the Reuben James did not unite the country for a declaration of war against Germany. That would not happen for another month when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. That's when the country became united and demanded war. Only against Japan, though. Roosevelt still had a problem. On December 8, 1941, he only asked for a declaration of war against Japan. He did not ask for a declaration of war against Germany. Luckily, Hitler solved Roosevelt's problem. December 11, 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States of America. Roosevelt, Congress, and the American people were only too happy to oblige him. The U.S. was finally in the war to save democracy from dictators. I know what you're saying. What about Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the USSR? Well, what can I say? Hitler attacked him. We were at war with Hitler. Sometimes you just can't pick your allies. Sometimes circumstances works out that way. Hey, Churchill even said, in reference to Stalin, if Hitler had invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil. One other interesting fact about Stalin, when he made the non-aggression pact with Germany, the Communist Party USA was constantly protesting that America should stay out of the war, stop aiding Britain. Roosevelt was a warmonger. Now, it was not our war. Once Hitler invaded the USSR, Communist Party USA demanded that the U.S. declare war on Germany. They declared it was America's duty to stop fascism. Now, we needed to give Stalin everything he needed to defeat Hitler. Oh well. So, what's the takeaway from this slice of history? Well, as far as Roosevelt was concerned, there's always a way around the rules. Things haven't changed in Washington. Self-serving politicians, under the guise of looking out for the American people, will always be publicity hounds making dire predictions about what will happen if a bill is passed or if a bill is not passed. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle the elected official is on. Also, during wartime, you can't always pick your allies. Circumstances of war can pick them for you. This is our history. This is our heritage. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and ring the bell to be notified every time I post a new content. Thank you for watching.